I think it's very important that we cooperate. For instance, a day like this, or the conference today and tomorrow, that we share experiences and good examples and always aim to best practice together.
I think it's very important that someone is showing the way, and I think that it's a good lab to try to figure out how you can build a more sustainable world.
At the moment, Nordic countries are rather like an example or like a big brother, and I think it's more about other countries that are more behind or haven't even begun to think about these topics. They should be like learning from those ahead and not go through all the steps and the mistakes.
I would raise a finger and say, be a little bit careful. To be a good example could also be to take a step backward and, as I said earlier, reflect. To be in the forefront should never be an objective as such.
Actually, I think we can contribute with our solutions and with the models that we see in the different Scandinavian countries that are very much based on interdisciplinary ways of working together. So we see it with states and municipalities and bottom-up driven initiatives that all create these unique solutions that attracts international awareness.
If you go back in history and if you look of the very famous Mayan cities in Central America, why did people abandon them? They grew too fast, too many people gathered, and they couldn't cope. So the cities started to poison themselves. And so the rulers at the time ordered people to get out. I don't think this would happen today, but I'm a bit surprised because we have a fantastic logistic today when it comes to you know, being in contact without seeing one another in persona. And that would allow cities to, in a way, stop growing and smaller towns and villages to start growing instead, and then create a better environment.
It's urgent that we do something. We can't neglect, for instance, the climate change any longer. We have to do something. And each one of us has a part, and we can act, and we should act, and it's very urgent.
The challenges we are facing on a global level calls for like much more radical solutions that we need to face quite quickly. The way we produce buildings with the use of concrete, that has a huge CO2 emission in itself. We have to come up with other ways to cut the emissions in a clever way, where we upcycle all the materials that are being part of the production.
We see a dialogue in society that is less based on the will to understand and more based on the will to polarize. And I think public space can help us to a situation where we can have a conversation built on understanding and the democratic values that we build our societies on.
I was very into science fiction when I was a teenager, and people were like, why do you think that's so interesting? And it turns out that a lot of it has come true, and we have to make sure that the dystopian picture of a future doesn't come through, and it's still, we still have time, but we need people to understand that these are actually important issues and we got to change the course.
I want to mention the climate law that we passed here in Sweden, that will ensure that any government, any future government, will have to respect planetary boundaries and submissions and emissions in its policy and the way they steer the country. And that is one way of making sure that we keep a planet also for future generations.
I think an educated civil society can change the world right now. We see like a lot of examples of grassroots movement, and I believe in these strong social forces, and I think they have planners and policymakers has a lot to learn with people. I also believe that we have like a good potential with technology, but this is not all. But we have like a really good competences here in the Nordics that can make a difference.
For example, in Sweden and in Malmö now, where I work, we have a booming gaming industry. What is their role in the urban development? We have the smart cities are exploding, but the gaming industry isn't really involved yet. So that's one really important part of it as well, involving actors that probably have the know-how.
Architecture is much more than just a design. Architecture is this capability of overseeing and having an overview of how all things are connected together. So the living, the cultural, and everything that is in between. So we have to be more able as architects to communicate the values of such things.
Basically everything we see around us that has been a negative force in the world is sort of created by men, and greedy men, selfish men, who have felt that they need to prove something for the world and dominate the world, dominate the women. And I'm not saying that women are perfect, but I think that it's time to get another point of view, and I think that it's time that we get women really into the systems and a different thinking.
Curiosity. Reading, listening, talking, never leaving a stone untouched. Oh, what's that? Oh. And trying not to have, well, we all have prejudices, but I try to have as little prejudice as possible, because prejudice is something which stops. It's like a big, huge obstacle.
I learn from my colleagues' failures, from other cities' failures, and this is also an important thing in the Nordic context, that there's a stigma on failure. We really need to get around that if we are to move forward more rapidly.
I always mention BitTorrent in this conversation in some way, because today we're like, okay, it's fine. You take a file or whatever and you split it into pieces and distribute it. But at the time when it came, just like when the iPhone came, it was just like, really? So we have to look for those solutions in everything, in architecture, in design, in politics, in dating apps, what do I know? You know, it's just like people who find a different way to do things.